What happens when an American oil company descends upon a small African village? Mbue will be here to discuss her second novel, How Beautiful We Were. How and why do civilizations disappear? Annalee Newitz will join us to discuss Four Lost Cities, a secret history of the urban age. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast for the New York Times. It's March 12th. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now from the Hudson Valley is Mbue. Her new book is called How Beautiful We Were, and it's reviewed on the cover of the book review. Mbue, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
All right, for those who have not read this book, and it's just out, so we forgive them, just set the scene a little bit for us. What is the book about?
So this is a story about what happened when a small African village named Kosawa, it's a fictional village, the residents there decide to fight against an American oil company that has been polluting their land for many years. By the time the story starts, the oil company has been there for at least 2 decades. And there's been a ton of environmental degradation. The rivers are covered with toxic waste, the pipelines are spilling, the air is covered with just a lot of pollution, and the children in the village are dying from all this pollution, and the villagers are not sure what to do. And so when the story begins, a madman in the village comes out with a strategy to get the oil company to do something about fixing the situation.
All right. I don't want to give away too much plot, so we'll pause there. You make an interesting decision in terms of the setting. As you said, it's a fictional village, Kosawa, in an unnamed African country. Why did you choose to do that as opposed to, say, set it in a specific country that we're all familiar with? And you yourself are from Cameroon.
That's correct. I'm from Cameroon. And the story just needed to be in a fictional place because I had been inspired by many different stories of environmental degradation and stories of resistance and uprisings and revolutions. And I couldn't exactly put everything in one place because nothing could fit. It was just a lot to fit into one particular place. I grew up in Cameroon. Cameroon, for people who don't know it, is a bilingual country. It's mostly French speaking. And I grew up in the English speaking part. And the English speakers in Cameroon were very marginalized. So I had similar feelings growing up the way the villagers had about living in a country that was ruled by a dictator, because Cameroon also has a dictator. Our president has been there for almost 40 years now. So I also grew up in a town that had oil. I was very aware of the politics of oil, about how the people who live on the land don't exactly benefit as much as the country's elite. And growing up also, there was a crisis in Nigeria. And that also really affected me because I understood like how much suffering went there. And then I came to America, and there was a lot that happened in America also that inspired the story. The BP oil spill happened, and Standing Rock, and Flint, Michigan. And because I wrote this novel over so many years, I had so many different stories and characters and people who inspired it, like revolutionaries, like from Dr. King to Mandela to Gandhi, and also African revolutionaries like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara. Those were all inspirations. So it was just too much to put in one particular place. It wasn't going to work. So I decided to create a fictional.
You said you worked on the book for many years. Did you start this before your 2016 debut novel, Behold the Dreamers, came out?
I did. I started this novel way before. I started this novel in 2002. This was the first thing I started writing the moment I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to start writing. So I started writing this novel. And of course, back then I didn't know the first thing about writing. So I just mostly wrote for the fun of it as a hobby. I spent the next 9 years writing it. And I think I probably wrote one chapter in those 9 years. But I was very much enjoying it. And then one day I had an inspiration to write Behold the Dreamers. I was walking out on the street, I saw chauffeurs, and I thought, why don't I write a novel about 2 families in New York City during the financial crisis? And it was such a joy to leave this fictional African village and move to New York City and write a novel where characters are taking subways and going to Colombo Circle and establishing what was my life back then. So it was so freeing, and I really enjoyed writing Behold the Dreamers. But the moment that book came out, I knew that I couldn't let this story go because it was just haunting me. I knew I had to go back to it.
It must have been an interesting experience to have had this entire other novel intervene in the middle of the process. When you came back to it, I'm sure you came back to it with a fresh eye in certain ways, but what were your impressions upon going back to that original manuscript? And maybe did aspects of working on this other novel then inform a change in approach?
Yes, yes, very much so. I First of all, I had actually learned how to write. Right, I had also, worked writing Behold the Dreamer. That was my first book. I had no creative writing background, so that was such an education. And then I also went back to it in 2016, which was a very unique year. Most were all there. And remember, 2016, it was, Flint, Michigan had happened, and Sandy Hook had happened a few years before. So I was thinking a lot about children. I was thinking a lot about what it means to be a child growing up in a world in which you don't understand why things are happening and nobody's doing something about it. And that was what gave me the inspiration to tell the story mostly from the point of view of the children. That definitely changed a huge part of the story. I also knew that I wanted the story to capture like what I was feeling that moment, because 2016 was a difficult year for me. Just, like most citizens, I was very concerned about the country and the frustration. And there was the rise of all these movements, Black Lives Matter, which had risen before, and the Women's March, and all these protests that were going on. So that had made me grow up a lot as a person, and as a writer. It had all pushed me to grow. And so I knew that I was better equipped. I was better equipped to write the novel. I don't think I was much as equipped. I'm just one of those writers that I really need to slowly grow and get better. Just in the case of this particular novel, it just took me lots of years to get there.
One of the interesting choices you make with both books is to set the novel in the recent past. I don't want to think of 1980, where this novel begins, as historical fiction. I'm not ready for that yet, personally, to think of any time when I'm alive as historical. But just as Behold the Dreamers was around the time of the financial crisis, this novel takes place in 1980. Why did you decide to do that? Why that period?
Well, mostly because that was a unique time in Africa. I grew up in the 80s, and it was, colonialism had just ended a few couple of decades before, and we're in this neo-colonial period. And in my country in particular, like I said, I was living in a dictatorship, and there was this bubbling energy of what do we do? We don't like the situation. We don't like the dictatorship. We don't like all these injustices, but what do we do about it? And that is what I was hoping to capture at that particular time. It was also important to me to show how the characters grow and change by the experiences of moving into a new world, because this, when the novel starts in 1980, it's a very different world from when the novel ends in 2020, where we see them having flat screen TVs and cell phones. And also the character of Tula, who is the main character in the novel, the way in which she grew by coming to America and learning about democracy, it just seemed to me like the perfect time from the 80s to the 21st century to explore all of those issues.
This is a novel about colonialism and corruption and power, but it's not a simple story of here is the good side and here is the evil side. Without giving away too much by way of plot, can you talk about some of the complexities you wanted to convey here, the relationship between the village and the government, between the government dictator and Paxton, the American oil company?
I am not interested in good guys versus bad guys. I mean, as a writer, complexity is what interests me. I have never met a single human being who is not complex. And so even when I'm writing about the villagers and about their struggles, I know that these are humans, and that as much as they want to live in a safe and clean environment, they also have their shortcomings. And just as the Pexin, the American oil company, the people who work there, they're also human beings, and they also have their own struggles. So it was important to me to present a story of human beings. They're on different sides, but on each side they're human beings. And ultimately, yes, it deals with a lot of heavy issues like colonialism and environmental degradation and dictatorship. But at the end of it, it is a story about human beings. It's a story about husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and friends. The story follows a group of children growing up together, and what it was like for them to grow up together and ultimately take up this fight that their parents started. So I don't exactly write with an agenda. I'm not hoping that you read this book and say, oh, all companies are the worst, or oh, African villagers are the best. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in presenting a story and letting you decide for yourself.
You grew up, as you mentioned, in Cameroon and obviously have been living in America for a number of years now. In what ways has living in this country complicated your ideas around these issues? Or maybe it's clarified. I don't know.
It definitely has opened my mind. You know, I tell people that Cameroon shaped my character, but America shaped my mind. I mean, there's a reason why I started writing when I read American writers, because coming to America, coming to a place, at least I've mostly lived on the East Coast. So in the East Coast, especially New York City, it's a place where people are allowed to question everything and challenge everything, which is so new to me. I didn't grow up in a world where you could challenge your government. You know, I mean, we had a dictatorship. There was no freedom of speech. You can't just stand up on TV and say, I don't like what the president is doing. That was all very fascinating to me when I came here. So America gave me the freedom to actually write. America told me that you can write what you think. You can tell the stories that matter to you. It's okay. So that was one of the blessings of this country, that the country has given me that freedom to actually think for myself and know that my thoughts and ideas are also valid.
Who were some of those American writers that you read that sort of shaped those ideas when you got here?
I started off with Toni Morrison. She was an Oprah book club pick, and so I started reading her because of the Oprah book club. And then after that, I moved to Franzine. I am a huge fan of Junot Diaz and Jhumpa Lahiri. I never heard of the American greats, you know, all the classics, the Hemingway and Fitzgerald. I never heard of those guys growing up. So it was only after I started reading American writers that I also discovered their work. But this novel is also very, very heavily influenced by the African greats. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a writer that very much influenced me. I grew up also at a time where, you know, Chinua Achebe, we all read him in school, Kamara Lai, Buchi Emecheta, those are also really great writers. So that is one of the blessings I have of having grown up in Cameroon and then coming to America, because the books I read and the ones I discovered in America, they really helped me discover myself as a writer, even though I never intended to become a writer. But it's interesting that it was an American writer, Toni Morrison, who once I read her book, I thought to myself, wow, I'm going to take a stab at writing something myself.
What did you want to become before you became a writer?
A college professor.
A professor of?
I was hoping to become a professor of education. I actually got into a PhD program, and then I didn't go into PhD. I decided to keep my corporate job, and then I lost my corporate job, and I said, let me take a stab at writing.
Most people don't go that trajectory. If everything else fails, I'll just make a living writing.
Yeah, no, I like to say I became a writer kicking and screaming because I tried everything else, nothing worked, and then I said, okay, fine, let's just do this writing thing. And now it is a great privilege.
Well, you very much succeed in this novel. I want to actually touch on the title for a moment. How beautiful we were. It's very powerful. Where did that come from?
That is from the biblical book of Song of Solomon, which is interesting because I love the book of Song of Solomon, and that is what drew me to Toni Morrison, because the book that made me a writer in a way was Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. And I was reading the biblical book of Song of Solomon, and there was a verse that said, "How beautiful you are, my darling! Oh, how beautiful!" And I thought, wow, what a declaration of love. And I think that is what drew me to it, because ultimately this novel is a love song. It's a love song that these people have for their community. And to me, it's a love song to all the great revolutionaries who inspired me to think about a character like Tula. And it is a love song to literature, because I became the writer I am today because of all the great literature that I've had the joy of reading. And so I thought, you know, how beautiful you are, my darling. And I said, well, these villagers are speaking as one. So, and they're looking back, you know, most of the story is looking back on their village and their struggle to fight for a survival. So it just seemed to me that how beautiful we were captures that nostalgia and that and what that place means to them.
One final question, a look ahead. Both of your first two novels were books that you started in the middle of another book. So you didn't have to kind of start from scratch on
That's
either one. What are you doing? What are you working on now?
that's a good point. I said to myself, I said, oh no, I have to start something from scratch now because I don't have a project that I had before. I think I'm going to go in a whole other direction also. Behold the Dreamers was, you know, set in New York City, and this one is set in an African village, and I have an idea for what my next book will be about, and it will be a whole other direction as well.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that next time when that comes out. Until then, such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Imbolo Mbue's new book is called How Beautiful We Were. It's time to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review. And here is Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. I'm going to take you and listeners all the way back to our issue of August 12th, 1905, which was the first time an author photograph appeared on the cover of the book review. It was Edith Wharton. And as the editors wrote in a note, our portrait of Edith Wharton, whose serial novel in Scribner's The House of Mirth is so eagerly discussed this summer, is reproduced with her approval. And they added that this is the first portrait printed in the New York Times Book Review in 8 years or more. It was also, as I've said, the first time a photo appeared on the cover. And the editors went on to say, the departure from custom is surely justified by the widespread interest in the subject. The photograph itself, I know you can't see it, I'll describe it. It's fascinating. It's as exquisitely composed as a page in The House of Mirth. Wharton is in this fabulous Parisian lace tea dress. She's perched on a French Art Nouveau chair. She's resting these heavily beringed hands on a desk that's topped with crystal and silver lamps and a book stand and an inkwell. And there's a priceless Persian rug on the floor, and there's a marble bust in the background. And it's important to note that when this photograph and this issue appeared, the House of Mirth was really dividing New York society with its less than flattering depiction of some of its members. And this was at a time when many of the biggest novels of the day, if not all of the biggest novels, were published in serial form. And the first installment of House of Mirth had appeared in January 1905 in Scribner's magazine. The book review followed it. They weren't a fan at the beginning. In April, they said, Mrs. Wharton's serial in Scribner's The House of Mirth develops in a rather grim fashion. and they went on to say that the book's heroine, Lily Bart, was, quote, a bad woman now and promises to be a much worse woman before the story reaches its climax. We must be grateful for these glimpses of the inner social circle given by one who has the magic password.
So would the book review each installment of a book as it came out?
They would indeed. They would review each installment, and then months after the serial concluded, and The House of Mirth, I believe, took a full year to run, they would then review the book as a whole when it came out. I mean, they did this with Dickens, in the 1860s, the paper did. This is how they did it. These installments, these serial installments were so anticipated and so looked forward to that I think it would have been impossible for them not to write about them as they were appearing.
So book reviews could shift over time from, highly positive to very negative.
They could indeed. And in this case, the reverse happened because even though they were quite negative on the novel in April, by June, they were loving it. In July, they actually penned a little ditty, a little poem of their own, the book review, like about their love of the book. And by the time this issue came out in August, they wrote, some people felt that, quote, The House of Mirth, like most society novels, promises to reach no logical or dramatic conclusions, likely to end in the air with a question mark. But that's been sufficiently disproven in this latest installment, in which the drawing together of the meshes of the plot is readily observed. So yes, they came around completely. Another interesting thing was that what would happen is that people would pretend to have gotten hold of the whole thing before it ended and write reviews, which were entirely fake, which somehow seems like something which would happen today.
It feels exactly like something that would happen today. All right. Tina, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Annalee Newitz is the author of Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, and joins us now from an urban center on the other side of the country from me, San Francisco. Annalee, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, in addition to your work as a journalist and an editor and a podcaster, you write both fiction and nonfiction. I'd love to just give listeners a sense of your trajectory as a writer.
Sure. So I actually started as an academic, and so I've done that kind of writing too. And I started writing about technology and science in the aughts. And that took me toward thinking speculatively about the future a lot of the time. And of course, in journalism of the type that I do, we stick to the facts. You can't just speculate wildly about, what the social or political implications are going to be of a new phone or a new algorithm. So I kind of had all of these feelings stored up from years of doing fact-based journalism and poured that into my first novel, Autonomous, which is about a robot who is sentient, which is actually, in my journalism brain, I think very unlikely that we would have generalized AI anytime soon. But in fiction, I can give you that. And so the book dealt a lot with my concerns about how we're going to treat potential artificial intelligence and what the legal regime might be around AI of the future. So a lot of it deals with patent law, weird stuff like that, but also, gunfights and chases and corporate espionage and that kind of thing. And then I worked on another novel called Future of Another Timeline, and I was writing that simultaneously with Four Lost Cities. And it actually was kind of in conversation with Four Lost Cities because when you're writing a book about ancient history, all you do is wish that you had a time machine. So I wrote a novel about people who had access to time machines. I think of my fiction and nonfiction as kind of ways of letting off steam from each other, if that makes sense.
I was going to say, it feels like you are able to get all this sort of pent up creative energy and suppressed opinion and give it this outlet, which is probably very healthy.
At least for me, it really works. And it's funny because there's the pent up urge to give opinions and speculation in fiction. But then after I've been doing fiction for a while, I get really tired of making everything up. And I'm like, I just want to talk about things that are real. and so then I'm really driven back quite passionately to doing journalism. So I shuttle back and forth.
Well, and your fiction is mostly speculative fiction. So as far as unreal goes, it's quite unreal.
It is, yeah. The novel I'm working on now is set 50,000 years in the future on another planet. So, it's a healthy distance from reality, I would say.
Is that the Terraformers that's coming out later this year?
Yeah, it's actually coming out next year. So it's like many things in the pandemic, it's been a bit more slow going than originally planned.
Well, this book, Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, must have taken some amount of time just based on the research alone and the travel.
Yeah, it took me really all told, about 7 years. And a lot of that was just travel and reporting. It's very hard to visit these places, one after the other. I had to visit in the summers, which are the field seasons for archaeologists. So it was kind of each summer I planned a different trip to one of the cities. So it's quite a bit of thinking and getting dirty before I actually started typing.
I don't want to keep listeners in the dark. I want us to name these four cities, and then we'll talk about them a little bit later. But so that people know, the four cities are.
So the four cities are Çatalhöyük, which is a 9,000-year-old city in central Turkey. It's a very, very early city. Some would say a proto-city. The next city is Pompeii, which most people are familiar with. It was buried by Vesuvius, the volcano. But there's a very unusual story about how people survived that blast through urban planning. So then the other two cities are Angkor, which was the capital of the Khmer Empire about 1,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, and Cahokia, which is a large indigenous city across the Mississippi from St. Louis in southern Illinois today. And it was an incredible spiritual and cultural center at the heart of the Mississippian civilization about 1,000 years ago in the Americas. And it was abandoned long before white settlers arrived. So it's a city that kind of rose and fell during the period when there were no Westerners in the Americas.
Let's talk about a couple of the cities specifically and how they were lost, but maybe first how they arose. So Angkor, which most people think of in terms of Angkor Wat, the kind of the group of temples that now lies outside of Siem Reap in Cambodia, it's still there. It's not inhabited per se, but how did that arise? How did it get lost? And then discovered in the jungle by the French.
Yes, by a French guy. So Angkor grows out of a really long urban tradition in Southeast Asia. And so it's important to know that this wasn't just sort of like the first amazing city. It was, simply the latest in a long series of incredible urban centers in the area. And at its height, or at its largest, I should say, there were about 1 million people there, which made it the biggest city of its day, pretty much. I mean, it was in the top 3 big cities. And it came out of a combination of pragmatism, people wanting to band together and have farmland combined with a high-density living area, and a kind of spiritual or cultural shift in the region. The king of the Khmer Empire moved from a southern area up to this area that is now near Siem Reap, and started to order his followers to build. And one of the things that's really interesting about Angkor is that we know a lot about how labor worked there. They had a system called tax slavery, and tax slavery is where people do free labor for the state, whatever the state is, in return for various amenities. Like the amenity might just be you get to live here. In the case of Angkor, depending on the leadership, the amenities might mean we give you food, we give you shelter, we support your family, we give you education, healthcare. One of the great kings of Angkor, Jayavarman VII, is famous for having built over 100 hospitals for the empire. So we know that the system of kind of reciprocal relationships, like I give you free labor, you give me cool stuff, was what founded the city. And it was built on top of a much older settlement. It wasn't like it was a virgin land. And indeed, as they were building the city, they were creating huge reservoirs to capture water for the dry season. And in the process, they dug up, these workers, hundreds of years ago, dug up an older city that they may not have even known was there, an Iron Age city. And now that the reservoirs are dry, archaeologists are digging down and finding that too. And they're realizing that people at this ancient point in history were also rediscovering their own ancient history in the process of building the city. So it's just kind of an interesting way that the city began. And people came to the city because it became famous as a place where, of course, you could see incredible sights, these beautiful temples, these enormous reservoirs, but also there was incredible social mobility. There was no money, like no formal money system, but there was a great deal of wealth. These reciprocal systems of labor allowed for a whole class of artisans to flourish, and musicians, all part of either the king's kind of retinue, other local leaders. The canal system connected Angkor to a bunch of other towns and urban sites. The other thing I would say about Angkor that's important to keep in mind about any city is that cities are not loners. They always exist in a network of some kind, a transit network, a network of other cities that it trades with. And the other piece of that is cities always exist in connection with agriculture. Some kind of agriculture has to exist, a formal, organized agriculture to feed people in the city and give them other products too, and like textiles, for example. And so Angkor is a great city to study because the farmlands were within the city itself. It was a big, sprawling garden city. So it's very obvious from the remains of the city that people were farming within its boundaries. And over time, the politics in the city became more and more unstable. They had they had several decades of incredible flooding and drought that destroyed a lot of the city's infrastructure. The city was flooded multiple times. And the leadership of the city just didn't deal with it very well. They didn't continue to repay their labor for the work that they did. People started leaving. And the more people who left, the more the city fell apart. And finally, in the 15th century, the king and his gang left and went down to Phnom Penh, where they still are today. That's where the royal palace is. And at that point, the history gets really interesting because most history books say, oh, that was the fall of Angkor. That was it. Done. King's gone. But actually, for about 100 years, the city was still pretty populated, and people living there without the elites began recycling a lot of that infrastructure that had fallen apart and repairing it on their own. We have lots of evidence that bridges were repaired with blocks from temples and things like that. So it was a very slow process of emptying out. And because farms had always existed within the city itself, a lot of times people would just go back to being farmers. And from an archaeological perspective, if you're looking at the area, it looks like, oh, there was always a farm here. So was it ever a city? And the answer is yes, it was a city, but it just went from being a farm surrounded by city to a farm that wasn't surrounded by city anymore. And it's really only in the last couple of decades, because of LiDAR scans of the area, that we've really been able to see the full extent of the urban grid and have really realized, like, holy crap, like 1 million people really did live here. And we can see the remains of their streets and the foundations of their homes and all of that beneath the jungle that has grown up since they left.
So Pompeii and Angkor Wat are both places that, at least before quarantine, tourists would go, travelers could go there and did in droves apparently now at Angkor Wat. The city that you chose in Turkey, I thought it was going to be Cappadocia. I thought it was going to be one of those great underground cities, but it's not. And it's probably not a city that most people have ever heard of. So how did you come to choose it? And what are the remains like there today? Is this somewhere where people who are in the know go to look at the ruins?
You can go out to Çatalhöyük. There is a visitor center there, and I'm not sure that you'd be able to go and see the actual excavations, but there is stuff to see there for sure. But it's not a tourist destination at all. It's not really in tourist guides. I had been reading about it because of the fact that it is one of the earliest examples of a city that we have that has been systematically excavated. It's not like a modern city. A lot of archaeologists describe it as being like an outsized village. It doesn't have streets. It doesn't have big temples or government buildings. It's really a kind of honeycomb of condominiums. It's all these small houses stuck together made of mud brick and would have had wood at the time. That's all gone now. And so what it looks like today is 2 hills in central Turkey, and it is near the area, the Cappadocia region that has Derinkuyu and some of the underground cities, which are also awesome.
But not for the claustrophobic.
True. Actually, I hadn't thought about that. I'm not claustrophobic, so I went down into some of the really little narrow tunnels over there. At Çatalhöyük, there are these 2 low hills, and those hills are actually the remains of the city because the city was built from mud brick. And anytime a house would crumble or fall apart, people would just build another house on top of it. So over time, you build a hill under the city. And because people occupied it for almost 2,000 years, that's 2,000 years of crumbled up mud brick. So they're quite significant hills. And then on top, you see these big rectangular, almost football field sized excavation trenches that are covered with big shade structures so that you don't die while you're out there in the sun digging stuff up. And people are out there every summer for 2 to 3 months working, uncovering more layers of the city. In one excavation trench, which has been open now for almost 25 years, they've gotten down to the very, very earliest structures built in the city. So you can kind of walk in and see everything from the present day hill all the way deep down into 9,000 years ago when people first started building houses. And it used to be flat. So you can see what happened. And there's a lot of different landmarks within this excavation that you wouldn't think of as being landmarks, but one of them is known as the dairy line. And that's when people first started eating dairy products, and which would also mean engaging in animal husbandry with goats. And it's a huge change in human dietary practices, and it leads to a mutation, a genetic mutation that allows us to metabolize milk products more easily. And there's another line, which is when people start making ceramics, fired clay, so not just kind of sun-baked clay. And that's a big time saver because once you have ceramics, you can cook stews in pots over the fire and like leave. You don't have to keep messing with it or fussing. You can just kind of, it's a labor-saving device.
The Instapot of its era.
It is the Instapot of its era. And it revolutionizes human civilization. Ceramics turn out to be kind of the technical revolution of the Neolithic. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of that transformation. So both of those big moments in human urban culture happen at Çatalhöyük. They're happening elsewhere in the world too, but the point is that we can see that happening in this one place. It's like a slice of time showing the development of urban culture. So it's really incredible. And the place is just astonishing to visit. It's so well maintained and it's so easy to see all of these layers of built up civilization just right before your eyes by looking into these big excavation pits.
Are these losses of these cities or a kind of death, are they always tragedies or is it sometimes a good thing?
I think it's almost always both. It's a tragedy because, for us now in the present day, looking back, a lot of us would love to know more about what life was like in these places and be able to visit them in their prime. And so it's sad because we can't go and see them alive. But I also think that in many cases, people left these cities for good reason. The abandonment, it's a rejection of something that's gone wrong. And so I think it's good that we have these examples where we can say, oh, if city government fails to compensate workers, our city will fall apart. Maybe we could learn something from that and, I don't know, like raise the minimum wage or provide healthcare for workers. These are things that we're debating right now in our culture. And we do have these historical precedents that tell us, maybe doing that would be good for the health of your urban civilizations. The other part of that is that abandonment is an act of autonomy. And so when we see people abandoning cities by choice rather than by coercion, what it tells us is that people were free to choose other options and to build something new. And to me, partly because I guess I'm a science fiction writer and I think about the future a lot, there's something very hopeful about that we can see these moments in history where people were like, you know what? No, I actually don't like the way you're doing this. I'm going to go try something new. And we see them doing that repeatedly. And even in the life stories of these cities that do die, we see ample evidence that people really made efforts throughout the city's life to change the city, to meet new conditions, new social conditions, new environmental conditions. So the difference between a place like Cahokia or Angkor and New York City or San Francisco is really just one or two bad decisions about how to change the city. 2 or 3 bad choices about how to change that city leads to its abandonment. And sometimes cities start to be abandoned and then people come back. So it's really unpredictable, except the one thing we can predict is that over and over, people do leave a city that is being poorly maintained. That's kind of our big lesson is actually, it turns out infrastructure is really important.
This is maybe a little bit too close to reality in quarantine as we abandon our cities. You write in the introduction of your book about your father's death while you were researching the book. And given that this is a book in certain ways about death, and you talked about sort of new independence, in what ways did his death alter the direction of the book or your thinking about the book?
It happened right at the time when I was thinking about which cities I wanted to include. I had actually gone to Çatalhöyük partly because I was just trying to kind of get away from dealing with the aftermath. Whenever someone dies, there's all this bureaucratic stuff that you have to do that's kind of the worst part in a way. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to go somewhere totally unrelated. He committed suicide, which is something that people don't like to talk about very much. And also, it's a form of abandonment. It's a way of saying, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. It's not an accident. His life wasn't lost. He took it. And so I was thinking a lot about that. I mean, anyone who has a loved one who commits suicide, you think, why would they do that? Like, why would they abandon me? Why would they abandon all of us? And that was what really got me thinking about this question of, why do people abandon things that they love, like a city? It takes a lot to abandon a city. It's a huge sacrifice in a lot of ways. People leave their homes and their families and their friends. And so once I was thinking about that, that also kind of gave me a chance to realize that when people abandon a city, that maybe the most important part of that story isn't that moment of abandonment, but actually everything that led up to it, like everything that brought them to the city, that made them fall in love with the city, and then what changed. I think this happens a lot of times when we have a big life transition, whether it's because of a death or some other kind of upheaval. You just start thinking differently about a lot of narratives in your life. I'm a storyteller, so I always think of my life in terms of narratives. And I think his death let me recast these narratives of cities to think more about human agency in all of it. What made people want to be in these places? What made them want to leave? Make these great sacrifices to go. And that was what brought the cities to life for me. It was because suddenly I was thinking about this active process of going to the city and people coming and being like, wow, this place is great. I'm going to stay here. Oh, but now it sucks. I'm leaving. And of course, that narrative is stretched out over hundreds of years, right? It's not a human life narrative. It's a city life narrative. But yeah, it was definitely a big shift for me in my thinking about these cities.
Well, I think you've made it very clear that this is a very contemporary subject, despite the fact that you're writing about events of centuries and centuries ago. Annalee, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Annalee Newitz is the author of Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news to the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So this week, everyone is talking about what the world looks like a year into the pandemic. There's a lot of reflection on how different industries have been impacted. And in the literary world, of course, the real impact has been on booksellers, bookstores, as things have shifted online. Whereas print sales have been really good, in fact, better than usual, which has been a really surprising and encouraging trend. So there was one piece of good news this week. They announced that the Sydney Writers' Festival will go forward. And this is kind of a glimpse of what the post-pandemic future might look like for other countries. Of course, Australia has done a better job than some other continents in terms of controlling the pandemic. They have low case numbers and are very vigilant about testing. And so they just announced that they are going to hold the Sydney Writers' Festival. They're going to have 231 live events with more than 400 Australian-based speakers. And they will have some international writers, but those people will be appearing via video. There's going to be 15 international writers. But I was pleased to see this development because I think, a lot of people were wondering, now that we've all experimented with doing things online and, authors are holding readings via Zoom and literary festivals have tried to do kind of video events. Book Expo is not happening this year. It was canceled last year. They said it won't continue in its previous form. So in the United States, we're seeing like a real kind of almost permanent impact. It does look like internationally, though, some of these festivals that a lot of writers love will be revived in some form if they're smaller and more local, and as in this case, it's all Australians attending in person. Even that, I think, is a nice sign for people.
But you and I can go, right, Alexandra?
I'm planning. I was just going to bring up a little quick trip to Australia with
That's
you
right.
after this interview to see if I could squeeze it in. But they have a great lineup. They always do. But this year, the international authors, I think, are particularly exciting. They're going to feature Kazuo Ishiguro, Rachel Cusk, Judy Blume, Isabel Wilkerson, Peter Carey, Evan Osnos, Geraldine Brooks, and Bill Hayes, among others. So yeah, I'm jealous of Australia. I'm jealous of the fact that they have live literary events and literary culture is starting to come back along with the other arts. So Here in New York, they're allowing some performances to go forward on Broadway. Movie theaters are opening. Of course, bookstores have stayed open, but I don't think there have been anything like the literary events that we used to see in the past in terms of author readings and bookstore signings and things like that. But it is a little sign of hope for the future of live literary events.
I hope so. Insert existential scream here,
Yes.
at least for New Yorkers. All right, Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about the latest in literary criticism, Dwight Garner and Jennifer Sly. Hi there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi.
Jen, let's start with you. What did you review this week?
I reviewed a book called Lucky: How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency by Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes, two journalists. They're the authors of Shattered, which came out 4 years ago, which some listeners might remember. It was about the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 and basically how everything went wrong for her. A lot of it, they say, was actually her fault. And so this book, there's sort of a similar narrative to it in the sense that it's another book about campaign trail intrigue, but this one is about the opposite trajectory, from going from a campaign that wasn't favored to win to one that basically squeaked by in the end. They show us a little bit of the other Democratic contenders, but mostly it's focused on the Biden campaign, and it's told in two parts, I'd say, divided by Super Tuesday. And so until Super Tuesday, Biden was really not looked at as the favorite to win in terms of the party, but he was quite popular with voters according to polls, but he just couldn't seem to catch a break. And after Super Tuesday, after a key endorsement by Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, who is a key member of the Congressional Black Caucus, Biden essentially hit what amounts to, they say, is a string of green lights and came out at the end triumphant.
I have a series of skeptical questions.
Sure.
First of all, I'm just curious. Everyone is different in their interests in what to spend their time reading.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm curious, who is the audience for this book? We just got through the election. I feel like it can't get far enough behind us. Is it fun, interesting, exciting to be back there in 2020?
One of the questions I had reading this was, okay, I guess if somebody really wants to relive the past year, then this might be an interesting book to sort of parse all the ins and outs of what was going on behind the scenes. I think that I was also wondering, because their book Shattered did very well. It was a Times bestseller, I think, for a couple of weeks. And I think at that moment, it came out in the spring of 2017, people really wanted to know what happened to Clinton, why she lost. At the time, it was just the beginning of the Trump presidency. We weren't yet fully immersed in the nonstop, relentless news cycle that the Trump era, I think, is characterized by. And so I think it was just a very different moment. And so I'm curious to see how this book does, because I think it arrives at a time when perhaps for a number of people, they just want to move forward and they don't necessarily want to know about all the very minuscule detail or minute detail about the horse race. I think that there are people who are really invested in politics who will be curious and will learn stuff from this book. And I think maybe in the future, as a record of what, some people were saying was happening, it's useful. I should also point out that the authors talked to people on backgrounds. So, this is like another one of these political books where they're saying that somebody said to an associate X, Y, and Z. So take that with a grain of salt.
All right, I'm going to continue my skeptical line here, because I do feel like with Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016, there were many people, whether they were on the left, in the center, or on the anti-Trump right. It was a real emotional question, like, how could this have happened? Whereas with Biden's win, it sounds like the stakes here are, it turns out he just squeaked by. And I don't know who would find that emotionally rewarding, no matter where they are politically.
That's exactly it. I think that the dramatic arc of Shattered was quite obvious. I think the titles sort of tell you everything. I mean, one is called Shattered, which just sounds sort of intriguing and fascinating. And this one is called Lucky, which is just very different.
Barely, it could have been called.
Well, it's actually funny because I think, a lot of people might point out, well, Joe Biden won by something like 7 million votes. I mean, that's not really barely in the modern American context. And so the authors really have to emphasize, I think, a couple of things. One is that with the electoral college system, it does amount to barely in the sense that it's really only a few key states that are in play. And secondly, because of the primaries, there was a time where I think in Iowa, New Hampshire, Biden really placed poorly considering that he was such a well-known entity. So, they also have to emphasize that in that context, it really felt like a nail biter, at least for a while.
I always find this notion of a well-known entity intriguing and confounding because it's like sometimes you know too much,
Well, I think that's, and that's some of the criticisms that some Democrats had for Biden, which is essentially that the party should have somebody who can energize the base. And here's someone who's been in politics for decades, who's run for the Democratic nomination a couple of times before and lost. And what the authors say at the end is that ultimately did help him because in America 2020, that's really what voters wanted, and that Joe Biden himself knew that he had an instinct for knowing that the fact that, he was somebody who wasn't necessarily that exciting, but very experienced, that would work in his favor.
All right, I'm going to hold back on any more skeptical questions for now, although I am curious why all election books are written by a pair of reporters rather than just one. But here's my fun question, which is, what was the most surprising tidbit that you came across in, I don't know, perhaps some of that anonymous sourcing?
Well, there was, I don't know if I would call it surprising. There's a quote I mentioned in my review, after Super Tuesday basically coincides with the time of the pandemic. And you would think that would not necessarily be good for any candidate. And obviously, it posed a number of challenges, one of which was they couldn't necessarily do the kind of in-person outreach that the Democrats like to do. But it actually worked in Joe Biden's favor. At least that's the argument of the book. And they talk, actually, I shouldn't say that they necessarily talk to this person, but they have a quote from a senior campaign aide who says that COVID was the best thing to happen to him because it allowed him to show that he was able to empathize with a grieving American public and also highlight the contrast between himself and President Trump. So I thought that was kind of a really disturbing quote, but at the same time, the kind of quote that you go to a book like this for. Another thing that they mention is that Hillary Clinton apparently seriously considered running again, which did kind of shock me. I know that people have said that, and I know that was during the campaign, that was something that Republicans sort of floated as their nightmare scenario or the nightmare scenario. But I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, Allen and Parnes are very well sourced with the Hillary Clinton team, and so they begin the book actually with that they say that she considered running because she was so unimpressed with all of the candidates that she thought that she would have the best chance, which again sounds bizarre to me.
Goodbye, 2020. Over to you, Dwight. You reviewed something very different.
Gratefully, I was sitting here listening to Jen thinking, I would rather cut off a toe than read a book about last year's election. But I reviewed a new book by Sherry Turkle. She is the clinical psychologist and sort of thinker about ethics of technology at MIT. And she's been around for a long time. She's had some best-selling books like Alone Together from 2011 and Reclaiming Conversation from 2015. And I've always sort of avoided her in the past. I mean, I appreciate her as a public thinker, but her books aren't ones that I would run to. I'm interested in those topics, but let's say only enough to read a book review about them, perhaps, and not an entire book. But her new book, The Empathy Diaries, is a memoir, and it's beautiful. It is simply beautiful. It works on so many levels. It's very intellectually adventurous in a way. It takes us to her time at Harvard and Radcliffe in the 1960s, and it gives us this sort of intellectual ferment she finds there. And she goes to Paris in the 70s and becomes friends with the controversial French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and she reads Derrida and Foucault, she's very good about these worlds she moves in. But what's moving about this book is that she's always the same vaguely impoverished little girl who grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s in a loving family, but one filled with secrets. Her father wasn't around, and she comes to look for him later in life and finds out some disturbing things about how she was raised. And it's one of these memoirs that you start off thinking, wow, what a great first chapter. I bet she can't keep this up. And then she does. And then she does again. And then she does again and never puts a wrong foot. And I found it very moving and reads a bit like a novel.
Dwight, I was just wondering in this book, which sounds really fascinating, whether she makes any connection between the life that she's led and the work that she sort of became known for in the last decade or so.
She does. I mean, for one thing, her intellectual constellation was at Harvard and at MIT and the University of Chicago was always men. And she sort of describes, without leaning too hard on it, she evokes the climate of sexism and all these men with their overeducated brains and undereducated emotions. And it sort of fed her interest in the human side of technology. And the experiments her father performed on her, which I don't want to give too much away, and they're not sexual, they're not amazingly horrible, but they're strange. And he also demonstrated a real lack, I would say, use the word empathy again, and she ties all these things up into her interest in the human side of technology. At MIT, she was seen almost as an irritant. MIT was a place, as we know, filled with mathematicians and scientists who are driving things forward in terms of our technological future. And Sherry Turkle was sort of the in-house critic in some ways. So she was sort of treated as an outsider, and also her work was seen often by usually men, scientists and mathematicians, as not being rigorous. It's hard to quantify her work. She drew from many different disciplines, and she understands those criticisms, and she makes a case for why her work is important. And increasingly, as she tells these stories, you understand why her work matters.
But Dwight, you read a lot of memoirs. I think you have high standards. What is it that made this one stand out?
Well, I've talked a bit about some of why, but she does little things. I mean, she's an incredibly good writer about clothing. She grew up in this house in which guests weren't really allowed. Her family sort of felt they didn't use their fork right, and maybe they dressed funny, and they were sort of shy people who were scared of the outer world. And so we watched Sherry Turkle emerge into this world on a very high level. She goes to Radcliffe and is worried that she is wearing the wrong clothes, and she is wearing pantyhose. Everyone else is so simply dressed, and she thinks she wears the wrong underwear, and all of this stuff. And as she grows older, she talks about these totemic things that she saves to buy, whether it's a certain kind of bag that she loves or a certain dress, and she's held on to these things for decades. And she's just wonderful about well, as Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote, what a strange power there is in clothing. And Sherry Turkle evokes that. She's very good on food. She talks about the caviar and toast points she always had with Lacan in Paris. And she talks about sort of learning about food and what it is in a way that's very intuitive. And I just find it very moving. And the small things of life she gets at, as well as the larger intellectual themes.
I'm going to leave the last question to one of our listeners who sent this in. And maybe it's a good question, especially since you liked this book, Dwight, but this is for both of you. From Rita Bernabai, who asks, will you and your critics discuss, in general, what makes, quote unquote, a good book?
Well, for me, one of the first tests is, do I want to keep it in the house? I read a lot of books, and if I put a book on my shelf, especially a novel, and for me, that's the way, I want to read this book again. Somehow the book has enlarged my possibilities. It expanded my mind. It put my daily adventure as a mortal in more interesting context. And, you look for these things, but great and good books work on so many different kinds of levels. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, actually, it was something I was thinking about, in the context of whether we have different standards for different kinds of books, depending on what they're purporting to offer us. Dwight, your comment about whether or not you want to keep it on the shelf, I think that's a great one, because that's a big deal when you have a lot of books and you have to keep sort of sifting through them. When it comes to some of the books that I review, a lot of these information-heavy books having to do with, for example, politics, like we talked about today, there is also the question of what kind of book is this? Like, what is it for? I mean, there's the books that I want to read that sort of keep me company, that I'm privy to somebody else's consciousness. That's like a different kind of book than a book about political history, for example. And so I feel like for those books, I want to get the sense that somebody really understands their material, they've metabolized it, and that they can also sift it into their own distinct voice. I feel like voice is really important in nonfiction, even if it doesn't necessarily always come through.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be a voice there you want to return to, doesn't
Exactly.
there? I mean, I used to be kind of a snob about fiction versus nonfiction, and I'm not anymore. But I remember walking into friends' houses who were real political junkies, and they would have all these books on their shelves about political campaigns and books about oil written in the 70s, and I'd be like, who would ever want to reread those? And I think
Did
in
they
my house,
reread them?
I don't know, but their shelves were filled with them. And I always think, what is this? What is this crap? I mean, it's all books that mattered once, but I'm not like that so much anymore. But I would rather have an Iris Murdoch novel on my shelf than some book that was just a passing interesting book about politics or something like that.
I don't really care about voice for nonfiction. I care more about the information that is conveyed. And with fiction, though, if someone's voice, if I don't actively don't like the person, that somehow through their characters, through the layers of prose and imagination, I somehow imagine or I somehow believe that I really don't like the author, not the characters, but the author, then that book is out of here.
I do think that with voice, it doesn't necessarily for nonfiction, it doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of voice that you associate with, somebody who's just incredibly out there and distinct. But there is something that can happen, I think, with some of the best, even serious political books where you do get the sense of somebody's perspective, which I think can be really valuable, and their awareness of what their perspective offers and maybe also the limits to that perspective. I really like it when somebody is aware of not just what they know and how much they know, but also what they don't know.
I have a slightly different calculation for the keep or chuck question, which is it's not about whether I'm going to reread the book or not, because I so rarely reread, but it's about whether or not I think this is a book I might want to loan out, give away, or allow my children to discover one day, or my husband to find and pick up. And I end up getting rid of books that I think, this is something I actually would like to keep out of my kids' lives, even as adults. This
Really?
is just not, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Especially with fiction, really bad fiction. I'm like, this will not serve anyone.
I can never loan my fiction because I tend to have underlined it, and no one wants that. And I never borrow books because I know I don't want to give them back. So I'm not involved in this trade of books very much, and I should be.
All right, well, let's end with the titles of the books that you reviewed and whether or not you intend to keep them. Dwight?
The Empathy Diaries by Sherry Turkle, and I will not only keep it, I will buy 3 copies, 2 to give away at Christmas and 1 for myself.
I've reviewed Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency by Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes. And I'm ambivalent, but I think ultimately I'll keep it in the sense that I think in the future it'll be useful for me to at least have as a reference.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.